What happens when a woman who's spent her whole life building walls falls for the one man who was never supposed to get in? Clara Evans was never meant to matter. Just another assistant in a sea of forgettable faces at Grayson Holdings until she caught the attention of Julian Grayson, a cold, untouchable billionaire with power that made people either fear him or chase him. But Clara didn't fear him, and she never chased. So why couldn't he let her go in a world of glass towers, unspoken rules, and emotional silence? Two people who should have never collided suddenly find themselves entangled in something neither of them can control. Is it love, or is it just another dangerous game? Will she survive being wanted by a man who doesn't believe in love? And will he survive opening his heart to a woman who might just walk away? A story of tension, temptation, and the terrifying beauty of vulnerability. Before we begin this journey into secrets, power, and a love that was never supposed to happen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories. This is not just a love story. It's the moment everything changes. Now, let's begin. The silver tower of Grayson Holdings rose solemnly against the early morning sky of Chicago, its mirrored surface catching the light like a silent promise of control. It was not just a building, it was a declaration. Inside its sleek corridors, power shifted hands with a signature, and destinies were written over morning espresso. At the helm stood Julian Grayson, barely past 43, a man who had built an empire from the ashes of a childhood most would rather forget. People in his orbit spoke of him with a mix of admiration and dread. He didn't shout, he didn't rush. He simply decided, and the world adjusted. Mistakes irritated him. Hesitation bored him, and emotions. Those had no place in the world he ruled. So when Clara Evans, his assistant of nearly 8 months, handed him a letter that would change everything, it felt like a thread inside his carefully wound life had begun to fray. She had walked into his world like all the others, quiet, qualified, temporary. He had expected her to crumble, to flee before the pressure crushed her. But Clara, with her calm voice and unwavering gaze, had endured. Worse than that, she had held her own, and now, standing before him, her fingers barely steady, she offered not a mistake, but a choice. "I've decided to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian looked up slowly, the paper untouched in her hand. "You're resigning," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation of betrayal. "Yes, Mr. Grayson," she replied, avoiding his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Why?" She hesitated, just long enough for him to notice. "I believe it's time," she said, softer this time, "to move forward." To what exactly? His voice was low, clipped. She swallowed. Something more. Something better. He let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Better. Do you have any idea what people would trade to be where you are?" Clara's gaze finally met his. "I'm not most people." And that, Julian knew, was the real problem, because he didn't let go of what was still his. And Clara Evans was not finished business. She thought that would be it. She had said her quiet farewells, packed the desk she had once called a battlefield, and walked away from the 73rd floor with her spine straight and her heart unsure. But the next morning, when she returned only to collect her last paycheck, something waited for her on the receptionist's desk, sleek, heavy, and unmistakably deliberate. A new contract, with her name in bold across the top. She read it once, then again. Her hands began to tremble. A year, not a trial, not a suggestion, a binding agreement, a salary triple what she had been earning, non-negotiable terms, no exit clause. At the bottom, his name was written with the same certainty he used to close billion-dollar deals. And just above that, a single line that turned her blood cold. "Refuse this, and your career in this field is over." Clara stood still, the paper weighing more than it should. She had walked away from Julian Grayson, but somehow, He had rewritten the rules again. And now, she wasn't sure if she had been given an opportunity or walked straight into a cage made of glass. Clara had underestimated him. She truly believed she could leave, believed she could hand in a quiet letter and disappear like so many before her. But Julian Grayson wasn't the kind of man who let things slip through his fingers, especially not her. That evening, back in her dim apartment, she sat at the edge of her bed. The contract opened across her lap like a verdict. The words blurred together, but the meaning was razor-sharp. 12 months. No clause for withdrawal. Triple salary. Total control. With a breath that shook the quiet room, Clara picked up the pen and signed her name. Monday came too soon. The revolving glass doors of Grayson Holdings felt colder than she remembered. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors, met with glances that darted away the moment she looked up. It was as if everyone sensed what she had become, an unwilling piece in Julian Grayson's game. She was led to the highest floor, his private world. Until now, it had only been a distant concept, a place spoken about in rushed whispers. But today, it was her new reality. She was no longer a secretary. She was his personal assistant, and that changed everything. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a vast room of glass, steel, and silence. At its center sat Julian, behind a desk so large it seemed to anchor the room. His tailored charcoal suit framed him like armor, and the moment his gaze met hers, Clara felt the air shift. "You're late," he said, voice low and smooth. She blinked, glanced at her watch. "It's 8:55. I was told to arrive by 9. A flicker of amusement passed through his eyes, barely there. "You should have been here by 8. Her jaw tensed. "That's not in the agreement." Julian leaned back in his chair, watching her as though she were a riddle he hadn't quite solved. "Agreements are formality. Miss Evans, I value loyalty over ink on paper." Her grip tightened around the folder in her hand. "Then perhaps you shouldn't have backed me into a corner if loyalty was what you wanted." The silence that followed pressed against her chest, and then to her disbelief, he laughed, quiet, low, like it surprised even him. "You think I forced you," he said, rising from his seat with a grace too precise to be casual. "But be honest with yourself. Clara, did you really have another option?" She hated him for being right. She had bills, family to support, a life not built for risk. He had left her no exit, and both of them knew it. Still, she met his stare without flinching. "Then what is it you expect from me?" Julian walked toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The city unfolded before him like a chessboard. "You were exceptional in your role," he said. "You followed rules. You stayed composed. But this one is not about following. It's about being seen, heard, trusted." She crossed her arms. "And what exactly does that mean?" He turned, and when he spoke, his voice held something she hadn't heard before, something deeper, darker. "It means you're mine now." Her breath caught. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them, like a claim, not a statement, like this had never really been about work, like she had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed. The days that followed were a quiet war. Clara quickly realized that working beside Julian was nothing like working beneath him. He didn't simply demand results, he expected them before the words ever left his mouth. There was no room for error. Every appointment, every file, every word spoken had to be curated with surgical precision, and worst of all, he was always watching. It wasn't overt. It wasn't even obvious. But she felt it, the way his eyes lingered when she looked away, the way his silence stretched longer whenever she did something right. He was testing her, studying her, waiting for her to break. But if she had to survive in his world, she would do it her way, on her terms, and without ever letting him see how close he was to getting under her skin. Clara had promised herself she would endure this arrangement on her own terms. No matter how sharp his words, No matter how close he stood, she would not let Julian Grayson undo her. But that promise began to unravel on Thursday night. The office was nearly deserted. The city outside cloaked in the hush of midnight. She had just finished reviewing his packed calendar when his voice came through the intercom, low and unexpected. "Clara, come in." Her body ached with fatigue, but she smoothed her blouse, gathered her breath, and walked into the lion's den. Julian sat behind his desk, but he didn't look like the man who ruled boardrooms. His tie was undone, jacket gone, sleeves rolled up to the forearms. A glass of something amber sat near his hand. For the first time since she had known him, he looked tired. Without looking up, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She hesitated, then obeyed. Silence settled between them, stretched taut like the space between a match and the flame. Then he leaned forward, set the glass down slowly, and said in a voice that sounded almost human, "You're not what I expected." She raised an eyebrow. Is that a good thing or a warning? His gaze locked onto hers, intense, but not cruel, just curious. Most people try to impress me, or they try to vanish the moment I enter the room. You don't do either. Clara let out a breath of dry amusement. I don't have the time or the interest for either. A shadow of a smile touched his lips. Yet here you are. Her jaw tightened. Because you made it impossible for me to leave. For a beat. He said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "Do you really believe I forced you?" She didn't answer. Didn't have to. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. He didn't come closer, just looked at her the way a storm watches the shore. "You think this is a trap," he said. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "Isn't it?" And then he reached across the desk, not to grab, not to demand, just to brush his fingers, gently, against hers, a fleeting contact. But it lit something in her she didn't want to name. She didn't move, and neither did he. The space between them shifted, suddenly fragile, suddenly electric. His voice lowered, rougher than before. "I didn't trap you. I just gave you a reason not to walk away." Her heart thudded like a drum against her ribs. Logic screamed for her to stand, to end this. But she didn't, and he didn't either. They sat there for what felt like hours, caught in a silence that wasn't empty but full of what they didn't dare speak. Then, just as suddenly as he had leaned in, Julian pulled away. The transformation was immediate, his face composed, his voice cool. "You should go. It's late." Clara stood slowly, fury and confusion twisting in her gut. How could he switch off so easily, as if nothing had just happened, as if she hadn't felt the air between them shift into something dangerous and real, without a word? She turned and walked out, her bag clutched tight against her side. The echo of that single touch still clung to her skin, and no matter how hard she tried to shake it, she couldn't outrun what had just begun. Because Julian Grayson wasn't just a storm to be endured. He was a storm she wasn't sure she wanted to escape anymore. Clara told herself it meant nothing, that the electricity she felt from his touch was simply exhaustion, a byproduct of pressure and proximity. But as the night dragged on, and the silence of her apartment folded in around her, she realized something more unsettling. She couldn't stop thinking about him, and that terrified her more than anything else. The next morning, Clara arrived at the office earlier than usual, her jaw set, her expression guarded. She had spent years mastering the art of emotional compartmentalization. It was how she had survived harder jobs, harder people, harder truths. But Julian Grayson was not someone who could be neatly boxed away. The moment she stepped onto the executive floor, she felt his presence, thick in the air like static before a storm. His door was open, his voice, low and commanding, carried across the hallway. She knew she should walk past, go straight to her desk and bury herself in reports. But something curiosity, concern, Or maybe foolishness made her pause and glance inside, and what she saw stopped her breath. Julian stood by the tall window, backlit by the cloudy morning sky. His jacket was slung carelessly over the back of a chair, sleeves rolled up, shirt slightly untucked. He looked undone, like he hadn't slept, like something heavy had settled on his shoulders. She had never seen him look like that. Before she could second-guess herself, Clara lifted a hand and knocked gently on the doorframe. His head turned immediately, eyes sharp and alert, for a brief heartbeat. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe even softness, but it disappeared as fast as it came. "Clara," he said, his voice still rough from the call. "Come in." She stepped in quietly, placing a stack of neatly organized documents on his desk. "You look awful," she said before she could stop herself. One brow rose. "Good morning to you too." She crossed her arms. "Did you sleep at all?" A faint smirk pulled at his mouth. Concerned about me, she rolled her eyes. "Hardly. I just prefer not to deal with a CEO who's sleep-deprived and irritable." He chuckled softly, and for once it wasn't mocking. It was almost genuine. "I've had a lot to deal with," he admitted. She hesitated, then took a breath. "You know, you could let someone help." He turned his full attention on her, then eyes sharp, unreadable. "And who exactly do you have in mind?" Her heart skipped. She knew what he meant. She saw it in the way he looked at her, like she was both the problem and the solution. Before she could answer, Julian leaned back slightly, resting his weight against the edge of the desk. "You," he said simply, his voice quieter now, deeper. "I want you." Clara's breath hitched. This was dangerous ground. She needed to shut it down, remind him and herself that this was just business. But then his hand reached out and gently brushed her wrist. Barely a touch, but it sent heat surging through her veins. Her pulse thundered, and she knew he felt it, too. She snatched her hand back like it had burned her. "Don't!" His gaze darkened. "Don't!" What her voice was hoarse. "Don't play with me." A silence settled, thick and charged. Then, barely audible, he said, "You think this is a game?" Clara didn't have an answer. Because deep down, she didn't know anymore. She didn't know why her heartbeat quickened every time he entered the room, why she noticed the way his voice softened when he said her name, why she couldn't stop thinking about the way his fingers had barely grazed hers, and how that touch still lingered in her memory like a secret she wasn't ready to let go. The tension only grew worse in the days that followed. Clara tried to act like nothing had changed, clinging to professionalism like armor, but she felt it. The way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way the air thickened when it was just the two of them in the same room. And it wasn't just her who noticed. One afternoon, a co-worker leaned in and whispered with careful curiosity, "Did something happen between you and Mr.?" Grace and Clara let out a short laugh, too sharp to be real. "You're imagining things." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Then came the gala, a formal charity event hosted by the firm, a night of suits, silk, and silent auctions. Clara hadn't expected to attend. She certainly hadn't planned to, but just hours before the event, Julian had made it clear, with one look and a simple directive, that she would be by his side. And so she found herself beneath the high ceilings of the Ravendale Grand Ballroom, her borrowed dress flowing around her like a second skin, the air thick with perfume, music, and tension. She didn't need to search the crowd to find him. She could feel his eyes on her the moment she stepped into the room, and in that moment, Clara knew something with absolute clarity, whatever this was between them. It wasn't finished. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, filled with champagne flutes and murmurs that clung to the air like perfume. But Clara didn't hear any of it. Not the music, not the laughter, not even the distant calls of her name. Because every time she lifted her eyes, Julian Grayson was already watching. His gaze didn't waver, didn't soften. It simply waited. She needed to breathe. Escaping to the terrace, she let the cold night air kiss her cheeks, hoping it might clear her thoughts, but the relief was short-lived. She hadn't been alone for more than a heartbeat before his presence slid in behind her, silent, warm, certain. Running away, his voice was low, amused. She turned slowly, pulse pounding. "Don't flatter yourself," she muttered. A faint smile ghosted across his face. Too late. Then silence, the kind that hummed between two people standing on the edge of something irreversible. And then he reached for her. Not with force, not with urgency, but with a quiet conviction that made her knees weak. His fingers brushed against her jaw, lifting her chin gently, deliberately. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. She should have. Every logical cell in her body screamed that she should, but she didn't. She couldn't. And then he kissed her. The world slipped sideways. The city vanished. Time dissolved. There was only Julian, his breath, his skin, his mouth against hers like a question he already knew the answer to. His hand moved to the small of her back, steady and sure. The other cupped her face with a tenderness that broke her open. She felt everything, the heat of him, the strength, the restraint, the hunger he tried so hard to bury. She should have pulled away, should have reminded him and herself that this was wrong, that this was a mistake. But then his fingers slid into her hair, deepening the kiss. And Clara, who had spent nearly a year pretending she was untouchable, finally shattered. Her hands gripped the fabric of his jacket like it was the only thing keeping her standing. He tasted like power and whiskey and something she would never be able to forget. Just for a second. She let herself fall. Just this once. And then, like cold water crashing over her, reality returned. She gasped, breaking the kiss and stumbling back. Breath caught in her throat like it had been stolen. Her fingertips still tingled. Her body ached with confusion. Julian stood there, chest rising and falling, his usually impenetrable gaze now dark with something dangerous, something possessive. But he didn't reach for her again. He didn't need to. They both knew it wasn't over. Clara's voice shook. I have to go." His jaw tightened. "Clara, don't please," she whispered. And for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret. Restraint. A part of him he never showed anyone. Then, to her surprise, he nodded once and let her go. She walked away with trembling steps, each one feeling heavier than the last, because deep down she knew she wasn't really running from him. She was running from herself. The days that followed were a disaster. Clara avoided him at all costs. She worked through lunch, left early when she could, made sure she was never alone in a room with him. But Julian Grayson was not a man who let silence speak for too long, and he was certainly not the type to be ignored. It was nearly 10 in the evening when she heard his voice, cool and unmistakable, echoing through the still office. "Miss Evans. My office. Now." Her fingers froze over her keyboard. She could pretend she didn't hear. She could leave, delay the inevitable, but she wasn't a coward. So she stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked straight into the storm. Julian was by the window. The city sprawled beneath them in glowing constellations of light. His hands were in his pockets. His back was to her. But she knew he heard her enter. "You've been avoiding me," he said, without turning. She swallowed. "I've been working." He turned then, slowly, and of course, damn him, he looked composed, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't kissed her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. But Clara wasn't fooled. Not this time. He hadn't just kissed her. He had devoured her silence, filled the spaces she had spent years keeping empty. And now he stood there, calm and unreadable, as if none of it had ever happened. "As far as I can see," Julian said softly. "You've been running." Clara squared her shoulders. "I don't run." His lips curved. not quite a smile. No, you don't. And then, before she could process it, he stepped closer. Too close. The space between them vanished, replaced by the quiet pull of gravity that neither of them wanted to name. His fingers brushed against her wrist, a whisper of contact, and it set her nerves alight. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Her breath caught in her throat. "Tell me," he continued, his voice almost gentle, "that you don't want this." She should have. She needed to. But the lie wouldn't leave her lips. Clara jerked her arm away like his touch had burned her, retreating half a step. "This isn't happening." His gaze didn't waver. It already did. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "You kissed me back," Julian said, his voice lower now, sharper. "Why?" She shook her head, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. A long, dangerous pause stretched between them, full of things left unsaid. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Dark and quiet." She wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Julian didn't argue, didn't reach for her again. Instead, he leaned back against the edge of his desk, fingers tapping slowly against the polished surface. "Then let's make a deal." Clara frowned. A deal. He tilted his head slightly. "You want to pretend nothing happened? Fine. Prove it." Her stomach twisted. "Prove what you and me," he said simply. "For 1 month. We work together like none of this ever existed. No distractions. No reactions. You don't flinch when I touch you. You don't freeze when I get too close. You prove to me that I meant nothing." Clara's breath stopped. It was a trap. They both knew it. 1 month, he repeated, his eyes never leaving hers. "And if you succeed, I'll let you go. No more contracts, no more pressure. Nothing keeping you here." Her chest felt like it might shatter. It was insane, reckless. But if she said no now, if she walked away, he would know the truth that she already belonged to him in ways she couldn't admit. So she looked at him, summoned every last shred of defiance, and whispered, "Fine." A slow smile curled at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't victorious. It was dangerous. "Good," he said, his voice like velvet over a blade. Then, softer, almost like a promise. "Let the game begin." Clara had made her choice, and it was already consuming her. 30 days. That was the deal. 30 days of working beside Julian Grayson while pretending that nothing had happened, that her pulse didn't race when he walked into the room, that her skin didn't remember every place he'd touched. It was impossible. And yet she had agreed, because the alternative, admitting she wanted him, was far more terrifying. The first few days were torture. Julian was deliberate, subtle, strategic. He didn't touch her the way a man touches a woman, not in ways others would notice, but he did enough to undo her slowly. The brush of his hand against hers as he passed a file, the whisper of contact at the small of her back as they entered a meeting, the way he leaned in just a little too close when reading over her shoulder, his scent clean, sharp, utterly him clinging to her like an echo. He never said a word, never acknowledged the tension, but she knew he was watching, waiting, testing her. By the second week, Clara was unraveling. Sleep became a stranger. Her appetite faded. Every moment with him felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. One misstep from falling straight into something she wasn't sure she could survive. And he knew it. She could see it in his eyes every time she caught him watching her. Julian Grayson was waiting for her to break, and she didn't know how much longer she could pretend she hadn't already started to. His eyes held hers across the room, sharp, piercing, relentless. "Say it. Clara." They seemed to challenge. "Admit you want me," but she wouldn't. She couldn't. So Clara did the only thing she knew how to do. She acted like none of it touched her. She matched his gaze with steady indifference. She answered his quiet provocations with cool silence. She trained her body not to flinch when his hand brushed hers, even when her heart betrayed her with every beat. For a moment, She thought she was winning, until the rules changed. It began with a business trip, a last-minute deal in Denver, a weekend of negotiations that couldn't be delayed. Clara tried to argue, suggested someone else could go in her place, but Julian had only smirked, that maddening confidence in his voice. 1 month. Remember, you can handle a couple of days. She had nodded, jaw clenched. But deep down, she knew this was where the line would blur. The flight was uneventful, tense, but quiet. But when they reached the hotel, the real problem emerged. "I'm so sorry," the receptionist said, apologetic. "We've been overbooked due to the tech summit. There's only one suite left." Clara froze. Julian didn't. "That'll be fine," he said smoothly, not even looking at her. She turned to him, wide-eyed. "It will not be fine." He looked at her with faint amusement. "Relax. It's a 2-bedroom suite." She let out a slow, uneasy breath. 2 bedrooms. That should have reassured her. But the problem wasn't the room. It was him. Julian, dressed down in a black shirt and rolled-up sleeves, pouring himself a drink as the lights of the city flickered through the window. No tie, no jacket, just quiet confidence and a watchful gaze that followed her from across the room. He was still in control, and she was rapidly losing hers. Midnight came, and Clara couldn't sleep. She had tossed, turned, pushed thoughts of him to the corners of her mind, but they kept crawling back. She didn't mean to leave her room, but somehow she found herself stepping into the cool night air on the balcony, and there he was, waiting. "You're awake," he said, his voice low, calm as the night breeze. She nodded. "You either..." A beat of silence. Then she whispered, almost involuntarily, "It's because of you." The moment the words left her lips, she regretted them. Julian turned slowly, eyes locked onto hers, intense and unreadable. She should have left. She didn't. "You think I sleep soundly knowing you're in the next room," he murmured. "You think this is easy for me?" He stepped closer, just inches now, and when his fingers brushed against hers, it was like something broke inside her. "This has never been a game." "Clara," he said, barely more than a breath, and that was the moment she shattered. She reached for his shirt, pulled him to her, and then his mouth was on hers. There was no hesitation, no calculation, only need. His hands gripped her waist, lifted her like she weighed nothing, held her like she was something precious and breakable. This wasn't like before. This was desperation wrapped in surrender. Her breath hitched. He swallowed the sound, deepening the kiss. His hands slid into her hair, his lips fierce and aching with all the things they hadn't said. They didn't make it far, barely past the door. Julian pinned her gently to the wall, his mouth moving down her neck, his touch claiming her inch by inch. His hands were everywhere possessive, reverent like he had waited far too long to pretend anymore. And Clara, who had spent months building walls, didn't stop him. She let herself fall, because somewhere between the silence and the storm, she had already become his. Morning light crept through the windows, casting soft shadows across the bed. There was no awkwardness, no regret, just silence deep, reflective, almost fragile. Clara lay still, eyes open, her heart trying to process what had just happened, and then she felt him, his hand, slow and gentle, tracing along her waist, his breath warm against her shoulder. "Don't disappear on me," he whispered. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either, because whatever line they had once drawn, it no longer existed. "Don't vanish on me," he whispered, his lips barely grazing the curve of her shoulder. Clara didn't answer right away. Her chest ached with the weight of what they had just shared. The warmth of his skin was still pressed into hers like a secret she didn't know how to carry. "I wasn't planning to," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed herself. A beat of silence. Then, softly, "Good." He pressed a kiss to her skin, gentle as breath, before rising from the bed, slipping on his shirt without a word, and stepping out to the balcony. Clara remained where she was, wrapped in stillness and sheets and the undeniable truth she had fallen for Julian Grayson, and not in the casual, slow-burn way that stories romanticized. No, this fall was sharp, sudden, consuming. She had let him in, and now there was no undoing it. She could pretend all she wanted, but her body still carried his touch like a memory etched into her bones. Her lips still felt the ghost of his name against them, like he had spoken it with reverence, like it had meant something. No, she didn't regret what they had done. What she feared was what came next. Because Julian Grayson wasn't a man built for love, and she was a woman who had promised herself never to lose control again. The flight back to New York was quiet, not strained, not cold, just quiet. Julian was different now, more watchful, not retreating, not advancing, just waiting, for her to say something, to name the thing that had happened between them. But Clara had no words. She stared out the plane window, watching clouds blur into silence, trying to piece together what she had become, because she knew exactly what this was, a mistake, a beautiful, destructive, irreversible mistake. And yet, when the plane landed, and Julian's hand reached for hers, his fingers intertwining with quiet certainty, she didn't pull away, because even if she knew better, even if every step forward would hurt, she wasn't ready to let him go. Not yet. Back at the office, the illusion shattered quickly. There were meetings to lead, contracts to sign, emails to ignore. Life resumed its calculated rhythm, except nothing was the same. They pretended, as they had promised. But the truth was everywhere, in the way his gaze lingered on her across the boardroom table, in the way his hand brushed hers when no one was watching, in the way he said her name softer now, like a secret only they shared. And worst of all, Clara saw it in herself, the way her breath caught when he stepped too close, the way her skin responded before her mind could stop it, the way her heart had already betrayed her again and again. She was slipping, and she didn't know how to stop. It was a Tuesday night late, the office quiet and emptied when everything finally unraveled. Clara was at her desk, fingers hovering above the keyboard, trying to finish a report she couldn't focus on. And then she heard his voice. "Come in." Her pulse stumbled. She stood, unsure, but moved to his door. Inside, Julian stood by the window. His jacket was gone, his tie undone. A glass of whiskey hung from his hand like a familiar ritual. He didn't look at her when she entered. Lock the door. Her breath caught. Julian. Lock it. Clara. There was something in his voice, low, steady, dangerous, and against every warning in her body, she obeyed. The click of the lock echoed like a decision made. When she turned, he was already walking toward her. She barely had time to back up before her spine met the door, and he caged her in. One hand braced beside her head, the other reaching for her waist. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Not accusing, not gentle, just true. "I haven't." He cut her off with a look that silenced her completely. "Don't lie to me." Silence fell between them, but it was heavy-charged. Then, softer. "Tell me you regret it." Clara's throat tightened, her lips parted, but no sound came. He was offering her an escape, a way out, but she couldn't take it, because it would be a lie. She said nothing, and that silence was everything he needed. His hand slid upward, tilting her chin gently, forcing her to meet the full weight of his gaze. "You think I don't feel this too?" he whispered, voice rough, almost angry. "You think I don't wake up in the middle of the night thinking about you?" And suddenly, Clara realized she wasn't alone in the unraveling. Julian Grayson was falling too, and neither of them knew how to stop. Her breath trembled. "You think I wanted this?" Julian's voice cracked with something raw. "I didn't," he said. "God, Clara, I didn't." Her heart twisted. Then why he exhaled, sharp and broken. Because I can't stay away from you. And before she could speak, he closed the space between them. The kiss that followed wasn't gentle. It wasn't patient. It was reckless, desperate, a collision of everything they had denied for too long. She clung to him, fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt like it was the only thing keeping her from breaking. He kissed her like he was drowning, and she kissed him like she was willing to drown with him. The days that followed blurred into fragments of secret moments, fingertips grazing beneath boardroom tables, late-night whispers in his office, too quiet to be heard, the way his hand rested lightly on her back as they walked, as if grounding himself through her presence. But it wasn't just the touches. It was the way he spoke to her now, lower, warmer, like her name meant something he didn't quite know how to say aloud. It was how he opened pieces of his world, slowly, deliberately, letting her see parts of him no one else had. And it was how she let him in too, even though every part of her told her not to, because the closer they came, the more she feared what would happen when the moment inevitably shattered. Because Julian Grayson didn't let people in, and Clara Evans had never survived being left behind. Then came the gala. She had prepared for it like every other event professional, focused, poised. She had promised herself she would keep her distance, that she would remember who he was in the eyes of the world, that she would protect her heart. But the moment she stepped into the room and saw him tall, composed, powerful, his eyes finding hers across the chaos, she knew she was already undone. And when the woman approached him, elegant, familiar, a hand on his arm, her lips brushing words into his ear, and he didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Something inside Clara broke, because in that moment she remembered everything she had worked so hard to forget, who he was, what he could have, and what he had never promised her. She turned, and this time she didn't wait to see if he would follow. The next morning, for the first time since she'd walked into his world, Clara didn't show up to work. She didn't answer his calls. She didn't open her laptop. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, telling herself over and over again that this had been inevitable, that she had always known how this would end, that the only person she could blame was herself. And then a knock, soft at first, then his voice. Clara. Her heart stopped. She stayed still, every muscle locked. Open the door. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself not to move, not to hope. Then quieter, softer, wounded. Don't do this. Something in her broke. She rose, feet bare, heart in pieces. She walked across the room and opened the door. There he stood, Julian Grayson, disheveled, unshaven, lost. But his eyes, those relentless, guarded eyes, held only one thing now: fear. I never wanted this, he whispered, but I want you. She didn't speak, so he stepped forward, gently took her hand in his. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, but I want to try. If you'll let me. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. One condition. He waited. No more pretending. His lips curved. Not quite a smile. Deal. And when he kissed her this time, it wasn't desperate. It wasn't reckless. It was real. It was beginning again. And that was how Clara Evans, the woman who had sworn she'd never fall, chose to stay. Not because he had cornered her, not because he had offered her a contract, but because he had finally opened the one door she thought he never would. His heart. Some stories aren't loud. They don't begin with fireworks or end in grand declarations. Some stories grow quietly, in the spaces between a glance, a touch, a whispered truth. Clara and Julian's story was never meant to happen, but somehow it did. And in their chaos, they found something rare. Not just desire, but the kind of love that asks you to stay, even when it would be easier to walk away. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open the door. If this story touched your heart, made you feel, made you remember something of your own, Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a moment of stillness, and subscribe to Shining Stories for more tales that speak to the quiet corners of the soul. Until next time, keep feeling deeply, keep listening closely, and let stories keep you human.